an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I'm Erin Trafford.
I'm Dave Trafford, and welcome to this episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
This is the podcast series where we explore the role the forestry industry can play in fighting climate change.
And we begin this episode with the forestry subject that was top of mind right across Canada in 2023. Where does fire fit into forestry's fight against climate change? You might be surprised.
There's a phrase we heard a lot over the past few years as we worked our way through the pandemic. That phrase? Never let a good crisis go to waste. The point being, a crisis like COVID-19 created an environment that allows institutions, governments to do things they've never done before.
Yeah, we saw it on a number of levels. I mean, whether it was government rolling out financial support for business and workers during the lockdowns, or just the historic development of the vaccines to fight the virus.
We also saw similar action during the Great Recession caused by the global financial crisis back in 2008, 2009.
But, you know, the effect of those crises may well pale in comparison to the threat of climate change.
Distinguished delegates, colleagues, and friends, I am deeply grateful for all your hard work over the last 2 weeks.
That was more or less the tone at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai. One particular climate study painted a rather bleak picture.
We are running extraordinary existential risks with climate tipping points.
Tim Lenton is a professor from the University of Exeter's Global Systems Institute. He was the lead researcher on the Global Tipping Points report. It was released at COP28. Now, his report suggests this planet, the one we call home, is on the verge of 5 catastrophic climate tipping points. And these tipping points, he says, quote, can trigger devastating domino effects, including the loss of whole ecosystems and capacity to grow stable crops, with societal impacts including mass displacement, political instability, and financial collapse.
All right, so that feels bleaker than bleak.
Oh, no, but it gets better in a worse kind of way. Yeah, there's no fixing things once those dominoes start to tumble.
Can we even say that we aren't killing the planet, but rather the planet is more likely to kill us?
Yeah, that's a pretty fair assessment based on what I was reading. But as dire as this sounds, it's only half the story, because Lenton says there are positive tipping points.
But we're also on the cusp of being able to seize the opportunity of tipping things in a completely different direction.
He says there are a number of opportunities that will allow us to reverse the trends and the effects of climate change.
We have to find and trigger what I call positive tipping points that are going to accelerate the change we need in the way we power our society, and how we eat and how we sustain ourselves, and find some kind of new sustainable balance with our life support system, in essence, including the climate.
And one significant step in that direction came out of the final agreement at COP28.
And for the first time, to deliver on methane and emissions. And we have language on fossil fuel in our final agreement for the first time ever.
Nearly 200 countries at that summit agreed we need to transition away from the use of fossil fuel.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. The call to action at COP28 is key to the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to one that relies on sustainable, greener energy and tech.
Yes, and as we have said, the forestry industry, particularly Canadian forestry, has the opportunity to take a real leadership role here in shepherding that global transition. So where is that positive tipping point for forestry? Where can it have its greatest impact?
A large part of this is how we manage our forests.
We introduced you to Jamie Stephen in the first season of this podcast series.
My name is Jamie Stephen, and I'm the Managing Director of Torchlight.
He's the founder of Torchlight Bioresources, an expert in bioenergy and decarbonization strategies.
Now, he's going to tell you that forest management in Canada is a key factor when it comes to fires and reducing carbon emissions. But he also says the 2023 fires were the number one, the highest source of carbon emissions in Canada.
The emissions this year, CO2 emissions, Natural Resources Canada estimates that this year they'll be from wildfires around 2 gigatons. So to put that in perspective, that's 3 times our national greenhouse gas emissions that are actually reported in terms of fossil fuels and human induced.
2 gigatons. 3 times the amount from fossil fuels.
So even if we were to, miraculously eliminate all the fossil fuel emissions in Canada right now, we'd still have a carbon crisis because of emissions from wildfires and forest fires.
And that's a crisis we can't afford to waste.
In his view, Jamie says the 2023 fire season presents 2 opportunities. One is to refocus our approach to forest management to take fire into account, and the other is to figuratively fuel innovation, new technologies, new energy alternatives to make that shift from a fossil fuel economy to the cleaner, sustainable alternatives.
So let's tackle the forest management issue first.
We want you to meet Mike Morrow.
My name is Mike Morrow. I'm a Wildfire Prevention Officer with the BC Wildfire Service, and I work in the Southeast Fire Centre, and my area of location is Cranbrook, BC.
Among other things, Mike is an ignition specialist.
Wait, ignition? Makes him sound like a firebug.
Well, I guess he kind of is. He and his team, they do prescribed burning. In fact, they conducted a prescribed burn covering about 1,200 hectares near Acom First Nations Reserve. That's in British Columbia. And that was in April of 2023.
In July, we had a wildfire go through almost the exact same area. Unfortunately, 7 homes were lost on the Acom Reserve. But when that fire came off the reserve into the area that we assisted them with doing their big prescribed burn this year, that fire basically fell flat. It pretty well ran out of steam. And I'm quite confident from talking to my cohorts that were on that incident when it happened, if we would not have done that 1,200 hectare burn, there was probably a real good chance that we would have lost the Cranbrook International Airport.
So the prescribed burn effectively thins the forest in a controlled way.
Well, that's the idea. I mean, the interesting thing is prescribed burns aren't a new thing. They're among the traditional practices of First Nations and Indigenous communities in managing the health and well-being of a forest.
It's old wisdom that's becoming an integral element of 21st century forest management science. Meet Kari Stewart-Smith.
My name is Kari Stewart-Smith, and I am the Manager of Biodiversity and Wildlife for CANFOR, Canadian Operations.
Her focus on biodiversity and wildlife at CANFOR in BC has been challenged somewhat in the last year, all because of the extraordinary record-breaking fire season we saw in 2023.
Absolutely astonishing. We saw over 18 million hectares burned, which is roughly 5% of all the forested area in Canada.
When you hear that 5% of our forests were destroyed by fire in 2023, it sounds counterintuitive to talk about setting fires on purpose. But traditional burning practices effectively make that forest healthier and more resilient.
Indigenous nations often used fire in many places, and they would set fires that were fairly small and of low severity in order to clear the underbrush and the smaller trees away and create better habitat for plants and animals.
Now keep in mind, a healthier forest means a healthier community. The wood from the forest, the plants and animals that thrive were sources of food, clothing, energy, and shelter for First Nations people.
So we abandoned traditional First Nation burning practices 150 years ago and then ramped up efforts to preserve and conserve our forests.
It's been over 150 years, the cessation of Indigenous burning. Plus, we've had very effective fire suppression programs in place across the country since the 60s.
And all the best intentions to preserve and conserve forests means our forests are now denser. They're thicker than ever. The problem is, more trees in the forest means more fuel for fire, and that makes it more likely we'll see the kind of intense wildfires we saw in BC.
Our forests are now much denser in many places. And so this, of course, translates into higher fuel loading.
Higher fuel loading. That can be denser forests or dead wood. Either way, it presents potential dangers for more intense fires.
And Mike Morrow will tell you that some of that fuel actually comes from harvesting operations. I mean, there's going to be waste from the harvest. There's sawdust, there's brush. And he says the best way to protect that harvest area is
a prescribed burn.
Right.
To make sure that the harvesting blocks are as clean as they can be, or prescribed burned prior to planting, so that they become a buffer, not just another fuel.
Prescribed burns have also become part of the fire management plan. And that's to say, Mike Morrow's team would use a prescribed fire to control the path of a wildfire.
For example, some of these fires that are modified response that we're not fully actioning, we'll look at it with a biologist to see if we bring that fire down to a different area along a road, a river, whatever, if that would help us from a suppression tactic, as well if we do it with low-intensity fire, we can actually benefit that ecosystem.
So they are literally fighting fire with fire.
And areas where they've used these low-intensity controlled burns become fire barriers.
Just this year, just north of Cranbrook, there was a fire that began this summer. It was a very windy day, and as a result, a couple of power poles blew down. It started a fire. It was a grassy, dry area, and that fire just roared north. And it started into an area that was full of dense trees and just took off. And then it hit an area that had been treated over the last couple of years by the local Indigenous nation. They had thinned it and then actually conducted a prescribed burn in that April. When it hit that treated area, it basically dropped right to the ground and slowed down. And the firefighters were able to effectively fight it and stop the fire from continuing in that direction. And by doing so, they protected the airport, and they also protected a community lying further to the northwest.
No fuel, no fire.
When we have fire hit those things, we're finding that the fire is slowing right down and almost stopping.
So the concept of fighting fire with fire is not new. It's old wisdom that's proving to be sound science. The thinking around the use of fire is what's new when it comes to forest management and fire prevention. But Mike Morrow says we need to use fire more proactively.
Managing the forest is for timber harvesting, for recreation, for silviculture, for all that sort of thing. We're not really managing the forest because of fire. We're more responding to them after they start.
To be clear, we're never going to make our forests 100% fireproof. In fact, we don't want to. As we've said, fire is good for the forest, even if one wipes out an entire stand.
A fire sweeps through and is really a stand replacing phenomenon. And it sets the stage for regeneration by removing all that surface biomass. It's really like an amazing process for forest renewal.
Meet Jen Beverly.
Yeah, my name's Jen Beverly. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta.
Jen's research at the University of Alberta starts with an historic look at forest fires over the past century or so.
It's fascinating, actually, when you look at mapped outlines, the shapes of the fires historically that are recorded and digitized and mapped. often from remote sensing or satellite imagery, for example. You've got these great perimeter maps. And if you look at those historical maps, you can find example after example where these fires fit together like puzzle pieces.
Her research gives us a better understanding of the behavior of forest fires.
Here's a fire in the 1960s, and you can see that the next fire in the 1980s burned up right to the edges of the 1960s fire, and there's almost no overlap.
Why is there no overlap?
Because these fires create what I would say is a fuel-limited condition for a period of time, and because they are very intense, naturally intense fires in the boreal, it will create a patchwork where you've got in the post-fire state of the early stages of the development of the next stand, it's quite fuel limited.
It reinforces what Mike and Kari have told us. Fires can't burn when there's limited fuel. So while Mike's prescribed burns are part of the fire management approach in British Columbia, Jen's research makes it clear nature takes care of nature. Natural fires can create fire-protected areas that can last for decades.
It can range from about 25 to 40 years, potentially, depending on how extreme the weather is. So the more extreme the weather is, then that weather can overpower the fuels and you can get fires reburning earlier. But you do have a protective effect where for a period of time, you've got a fuel limited condition in the area that was disturbed.
Now, the interesting thing here is, in some cases, forest and fire management would be best served by just letting the fire burn. Do not fight the fire.
One of the things that fire suppression might have done is that, if you go out, you put the fire out when it's small, it never grows to a substantive size, and then it's not there on the landscape as a potential barrier to the next fire.
Just by limiting the size of that particular fire, and with all the right intentions, the best intentions in the world, because we want to save the forest, we're actually creating a more combustible environment for the future.
Right, and so the concern is that fire didn't happen as a stopping point for the next fire, and so when you do get that next fire, it's going to be a bigger fire.
Okay, so we've learned that fire is necessary to regenerate healthy forests.
And it may be the best preventative tool we have to deal with heavy fuel loading.
But resurrecting and renewing older traditional ideas with new thinking isn't enough to move the needle on climate change.
No, but when we integrate our improved understanding of fire behavior with a view from space, for example, our emergency and fire suppression efforts are all the more efficient.
All right, so let's take that view from space. Morgan Crowley has one of the coolest jobs ever.
My name is Dr. Morgan Crowley. I'm a forest fire research scientist with Natural Resources Canada.
She does research for the federal government here in Canada, but that's not all.
I'm also one of the science tier leaders on the upcoming Wildfire satellite mission, which is run by Natural Resources Canada and Environment Canada and the Canadian Space Agency together.
She works with the Canadian Space Agency.
Yeah, cool, huh? She's one of the science leaders on the Wildfire SAT mission.
All right, I'll bite. What's the Wildfire SAT mission?
I was ready. I knew you'd want to know.
Wildfire SAT is a satellite mission that will monitor all active wildfires in Canada on a daily basis. It will provide reliable data to allow for better prediction of fire behavior, to help wildfire managers prepare and respond, and allow for more targeted and faster evacuations. The Wildfire SAT mission will provide more precise information on smoke, air quality conditions, and the carbon emitted by wildfires, for protecting lives and health, as well as our resources, infrastructures, and environment.
We're using satellites to monitor all forest fires?
Yeah, that is the plan. The Wildfire SAT mission is expected to be fully functional in 2029. And that means, on a daily basis, Morgan Crowley and her team will have updated data on the progress, the behavior, the direction of active fires every day using Canadian and U.S. satellites.
It's called near real-time mapping, or even some people call it ultra near real-time mapping, because it's depending on the satellite source, you can have an observation within a couple hours of the passover just because of downlinking and everything. And so then we can have perspective closer in time to what the fire is doing.
Now, it's not real time, but it's near real time.
Rather than waiting, 2 to 4 hours from another satellite, we're going to be able to provide them wildfire sat data within 30 minutes.
That kind of information would be important for crews on the ground to know where those imminent dangers are and where to deploy resources.
Yeah, and where to focus the evacuation plans when necessary.
In addition to just the visible spectrum, we also collect things like infrared information that can tell you more intensity heat values. And so by combining all these different bands or, reflectance values together, then you can actually calculate other indices that we've corresponded with forest on the ground empirical measurements.
The cool thing is they've developed these specific satellites with input from foresters and fire services.
We've actually developed everything up to date, even just the requirements of the satellite itself, with fire agency representatives from across Canada.
Okay, Wildfire Sat is nothing like the forestry world your dad worked in back in the 1960s and 70s.
Not exactly. I mean, in Dad's day, the best they might have had to track fire was a de Havilland beaver or a forest ranger armed with, binoculars and a radio up in some observation tower.
That's not to say, though, that eyes and boots on the ground aren't still important when it comes to reporting and monitoring fires.
Satellites are really great. However, the agencies are going to get a notification from someone before even the satellite passes over.
Yeah, and the cool thing is, I keep saying that, right? The cool thing is, Canada's Wildfire Sat mission isn't the only one keeping an eye on wildfires.
Australia is really cool because they're working on a satellite that will do moisture predictive stuff, so that they can have early warning monitoring to say there's low fuel moisture in this area of the forest, so we should probably monitor that because if a fire ignition comes through, that's going to be the first to burn.
There are other programs in Australia and in the United States. In fact, Wildfire Sat is collaborating with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. NOAA has got a few satellites watching Canadian forests.
One thing that's really amazing about the Wildfire Sat mission is that we have a virtual constellation status with satellites from NOAA in the United States.
Yeah, between Canada and the U.S., these missions create this satellite constellation.
Instead of just using one satellite separately, you can really put them together and have a more continuous perspective. Instead of 4 observations a day from their satellites or just 2 from ours, you can then have 6 together, which is a huge, huge novelty.
And of course, logic follows. More eyes means more data that's being something akin to now currency in the world of forest and fire management.
We can kind of combine these satellites that have all these different strengths and leverage the strengths from the different satellites. So, for example, Wildfire Sat will have a passover during peak burn period in Canada, which is enormous. We don't have that perspective now. So we have that. From NOAA, we have the consistency through other parts of the day. And then through other kind of finer spatial resolution satellites like Landsat or Sentinel-2, we can have then, we've estimated what the burned area is, but now every 4 to 8 days, we get this perspective from one of those finer resolution satellites, and then we can kind of really clean up our map. So use the temporal data from these other satellites that I mentioned, the spatial information from finer resolution satellites, and then combine them together to have a better picture of the fire overall.
So let's just go back to Jen Beverly and her work at the University of Alberta. A lot of her work is focused on historic maps of forest fires. And all this new technology, the use of satellites, they've got drones and LiDAR and nearly real-time data, nearly makes her giddy.
That is the dream. that all of this data is going to feed over the next few years into entirely new approaches to modeling and understanding fires that will inform the decisions that have to be made about suppression and let burn for ecological purposes and other things.
You can see how connecting this high-tech view from space with eyes and boots on the ground, connecting innovative and emerging technologies with Jen's historic maps to map and model fire behavior can go a really long way toward mitigating the spread and the damage of wildfires.
Combined, all in, that saves lives, it saves money, and, to the point, it saves the environment.
Okay, so let's bring this all back now to the idea of using the fire to fight fire.
Well, we've learned that areas hit by fire create this natural protective fire barrier from future fires. So here's the question. How can we make the most of that learning?
There are some questions around anthropogenic disturbances.
How can we create protective fire barriers without fire? Researchers like Jen call them anthropogenic disturbances.
Sounds like a fancy word for a road.
Yeah, that would qualify. A road and more.
That could be in industrial areas, roads. In Alberta, we have lots of seismic lines crisscrossing the province. And then you also have harvest cut blocks. And there are some questions around, well, do these anthropogenic disturbances then provide a bit of a substitute that are breaking up some of the contiguity of the fuels?
Using urban planning, land use planning in support of forest management planning.
You can look at a landscape and proactively try to understand where would be the best places to stop a fire. So where would be a strategic containment area for containing a fire within maybe a zone that might be acceptable for it to burn within, especially if it's wilderness area or could fulfill some ecological objective.
Where does the urban planner or the city planner and the forester overlap there in terms of saying, this is how we're going to protect but maintain the forest and also protect the community?
Yeah, in the past, there was not a whole lot of overlap there, but increasingly you're seeing much, much more of that joint planning, which is really great. And so it really takes the involvement of all parties. It's the municipal governments or the regional districts together with the forest companies and the governments, the provincial governments that are in charge of forestry within the province, as well as the Indigenous governments and the communities. Everyone working together to conduct the planning for these projects to make sure that they get done around the communities and done around critical infrastructure.
That kind of thinking, that kind of contingency planning around what if scenarios, okay, what happens if we have a fire that cuts off the one egress route, the one road out of town, what are the options is I think essential in terms of shifting how we approach fires.
Now you'll remember that one of the major complaints that arose out of the Halifax fires was that there was only one road in and one road out of that fire zone.
Yeah, there had been warnings for years that this posed a real danger to the community for a variety of reasons. And it became all the more obvious when those fires hit in June of 2023.
So now, in the aftermath, you've got to hope, and you will know better than I, but you've got to hope that there's some thought given to reviewing that situation with input from, say, fire services and emergency services and those planning departments.
We're trying to combine biophysical assessments of the potential for fire with the road network. So overlaying the roads on the kind of models that my team does. And seeing, okay, well, here are some roads that are heavily exposed to potential wildfire. So let's go through a scenario where this road gets cut off and is not available for an evacuation. That's going to push the population to the remaining egress routes or roads. And you hope there are other ones, right? That you don't have that scenario where it's one road in, one road out.
So it's interesting to me to hear Jen and Kari and Mike and Morgan all talk about these new developments and opportunities to better manage fires. And by doing so, create opportunities to improve the air we breathe. They're positive tipping points, as Tim Lenton talked about. But they don't really fall into a category that I'd say is innovative.
Yeah, I had the same thought as I was talking to them. And I begin to wonder if we haven't skewed or corrupted our definition of innovation. The expectation doesn't match what it actually is. We generally think of the shiny new, never before done, never thought before technology or the product or the process as being innovative. But in this case, I keep hearing most of the answers are hiding in plain view. Biomass and biofuels are a pretty good example of that.
Exactly. They've been burning biomass as biofuels, essentially the leftover parts of the harvested trees and plants, to fuel district heating systems in the Nordic countries for years. There are municipalities in Sweden that use zero fossil fuels to heat their homes.
Yeah, but you bring it up here in North America and it sounds like some out-of-the-world idea, so I guess easily we label it innovative.
It's not necessarily a bad thing, though, particularly when it comes to governments that like to wave that innovation banner.
Well, that was evident when Canada's federal government unveiled its 2023 Fall Economic Update.
Those headlines all focused on affordability issues, and there was one section that specifically addressed affordable electricity and heat generation through, you guessed it, using biomass.
Yeah, without getting way down in the weeds, the government has officially recognized the use of sustainable biomass to help us meet our emissions targets and to make life more affordable for families and businesses.
But let's be clear, this is not new, even here in Canada. But the federal focus sure gives the biofuel sector a bit of a boost.
So we're going to explore this idea of using the whole log in the next episode.
And we're not just talking about using healthy harvested logs. We're going to introduce you to Etienne Vezina.
I'm Etienne Vezina, Senior Director Forestry with Resolute Forest Products based out of Montreal.
Etienne spends a good deal of his time harvesting wood from burned out forests.
Yeah. He and his crews actually go into burned areas and they salvage what they can from the remains of a forest fire.
For some of our facility this year, it's almost 100% of what was supposed to be planned harvest that became salvage harvest. So we could completely shift our operation into salvage operation.
So he's making the most of the burned log, not just the clean, pristine trees marked for the harvest.
All right, things we are learning, all coming up in the next episode of this podcast, Canadian Forestry Can Save the World. For our producer, Becky Coles, our technical producer, and our audio editor, Mike Trutler, for Aaron and the whole team at Story Studio Network, thanks for listening. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This
is SSN.